South Africa is set to host one of the world's largest gatherings of media, digital and information regulators, bringing together delegates from more than 50 countries in Pretoria on 12 and 13 February. The focus, building human rights-based governance of digital platforms, accountability, transparency and the growing risks linked to online harms, algorithmic curation and the new AI systems. A key outcome will be the Pretoria Action Plan on digital platform governance. Joining us now is Cristina Ruelas, Senior Programme Specialist at UNESCO, to explain what this conference aims to achieve and what it could mean for South Africans. Cristina, appreciate your time. Thank you much for speaking to us. And I suppose that is the all-important question. Why is this event being held? What is the problem that it's seeking to solve?
Thank you very much, Hugo. It's a pleasure to be here with you and your audience. As you might know, UNESCO has been working together with a group of regulators from all over the world to try to discuss how to better approach the governance of digital platforms while balancing the threats that we see in online content, meaning like disinformation, hate speech, conspiracy theories that are increasing in a scalable manner, but at the same time, we can protect freedom of expression and access to information. And in this manner, the ICT Forum of Regulators in South Africa got together and hosted us to have this discussion further, to bring this discussion further, and to try to create mechanisms of collaboration between southern regulators and northern regulators in order to advance on transparency issues, due diligence mechanisms for digital platforms to take on board in order to mitigate the risk that their services and products may pose over the users, to increase the mechanisms for users to have control over their engagement with these different services through media and information literacy programs, and to try to make sure that the systems and processes that are within the platforms are aligned to international human rights standards for the design, the content moderation and creation of content. So this is the discussions that we're going to have. We already have registered more or less 160 regulatory authorities that come from 50 countries around the world.
Now the one thing that you speak about is human rights standards, and that there's a standard across the globe. These standards aren't uniform wherever you go, are they? Right? And how do you draw a line? So, for instance, when we talk about the LGBTI plus community as an example, there are countries on the African continent where those rights are subdued, if you will. So how do you draw the line in creating a uniform human rights-based system?
So this is a very important question. Human rights standards are the agreements that are being upheld by member states in the United Nations, and particularly in UNESCO, over the last 80 years. And these are aligned with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, particularly the guidelines for the governance of digital platforms, which is the document that will be analyzed and evaluated during the conference in Pretoria. It's a document that is entrenched in Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of the International Human Rights, which it actually says that everyone has the possibility to speak freely, to gather ideas. But what it is very important is that it says also that there's some kind of restrictions that can be permissive when it comes to certain types of harms. And what the guidelines say clearly is how does these regulatory authorities can use the different elements of the international human rights principles in order to make sure that people can still engage actively online, but that platforms are responsible for providing mechanisms to establish risk assessments that can provide the users with mitigation measures, with the capacity to control their engagement, for the states and the member states to try to identify what are the audit process, the oversight mechanisms that they should put in place in order to mitigate these risks. So what the guidelines and the discussion on the conference would say is that it is important to create a balance where everyone can still engage in digital platforms, can engage in the different services and products, but can engage in a trustworthy manner.
All right, I want to touch on children and young people in particular. we've seen a shift in Australia where social media has been banned to those that are under 16. We're seemingly getting a similar reaction from the United Kingdom, and there seems to be a whole movement across the world around limiting access to social media for young people. Is this something that is likely to be tabled, firstly, and secondly, what is the conversation going to be around safeguarding young people online?
So the conference is going to discuss different approaches on digital platform governance when it comes to the protection of particular groups, particularly children and youth. But what is important to say is that when it comes, the UNESCO believes that in order to safeguard freedom of expression, access to information, and other human rights online, it is very important to look at the life cycle of the different technologies in order to adopt different governance mechanisms. What does this mean? That it means that whenever a new product or new service is going to be released or is going to be designed, the companies need to do a specific human rights impact assessment, and they should be accountable about the measures they are going to put forward in order to mitigate the risks that these different services pose to particular groups. In this regard, the idea of the conversation that we're going to have in Pretoria is to try to identify what is the key role that regulatory authorities or civil society, or for instance, parents, or other actors like the academic, the universities have to play in order to make sure that they actually mitigate this risk when there's the deployment of these new products and services. That's a key thing, and one of the key elements of this conversation also relies on the idea of a multi-stakeholder conversation, where we acknowledge that this is not a thing that should be discussed only between regulators and companies, but should bring on board other stakeholders, in this case particularly youth and children, and parents, of course.
And I want us to talk about what information ecosystem resilience looks like, especially during elections, and what role should platforms be required to play. I mean, the number of times that there's been an election on the African continent and there's been a total social media blackout for days, I mean, speak to those issues around suppression of the freedom of expression. Are you able to make governments accountable as part of that conversation?
Well, this is a very important thing. Any type of restrictions, such as shutdowns, are being called by the United Nations as disproportionate to disproportionate to and it creates a big impact to freedom of expression. What it is important to highlight, and this is something that is also mentioned within this document that I mentioned to you, that's called the Guidelines for the Governance of Digital Platforms, is that governments should refrain from these type of measures, as they are not the measures that should be upheld in order to enable the environment for everyone to engage freely in the civic space. What it is important to have in mind is that during the electoral processes, also there's a need, and actually some companies develop this, a risk assessment on what are the different specific risks that the different users may face, or that a specific type of information may face during the electoral process, and how they are going to counter it. And it is important to say that, for instance, in the case of the African continent, there was a release of a guidelines for the digital platforms during the electoral process in 2024, acknowledging that there was a lot of elections happening during the period that actually aimed to try to protect the participation of the people and engage with the information that was needed for their engagement in the electoral process, but at the same time try to create a mitigation of risk of type of disinformation, such as systemic disinformation or systemic hate speech. And this was done through an engagement, a collaborative engagement between electoral management bodies, the digital platforms, and also civil society actors and academic groups. They all came together and tried to engage in a way that each one would identify the role and would mitigate the risk that they were looking at before the elections.
Cristina Ruelas, Senior Programme Specialist at UNESCO, speaking to us ahead of the Media, Digital and Information Regulation gathering in South Africa this week to advance human rights-based governance on digital platforms. Appreciate your time. We certainly look forward to meeting you when you come into South Africa and enjoy South African hospitality.
Thank you very much. I look forward to be there.
All right, and that's where we leave that conversation.